if you look around, things can, at first glance, look very much like the 1970s. So, rocketing price of oil, tick. Inflation, a real problem for people, tick. And the article is trying to make the case that the other thing that perhaps we're going to see a comeback of is lots of trade union disputes and strikes. It does have a little graph of the number of days lost through strike action, which is ticking up a little bit, but it's kind of 2 million days a year compared to 25 million as it used to be. So, I mean, and my broad idea is that this article is a bit misguided, really, and I don't think that there's any great indication that there's going to be a return of trade union power. Perhaps just to talk a bit about trade unions, because as you know, I did a speech on this at one of our local groups, and so did have a few numbers to hand that I thought it might be good to share with people. So there's about 6.4 million workers in trade unions now, which is a massive fall from where we used to be. Slightly more women than men, 3.7 million women, 2.7 million men. And the overall level of people in trade unions, I think something like 40%, but that hides, I think, the fact that it's about 50% in the public sector and only about 12% in the private sector. So the really big areas where we have trade union members are really the public services, in particular education, health, transport. You might say that's not all public sector these days, but it's kind of semi-public, public service area. And I think about 40% of people are covered by what we call in the trade CBAs, collective bargaining agreements. That's where your pay and terms and conditions are set by a central agreement rather than you negotiating them separately for yourself. So none of that to me screams out, a return of mass trade union membership. The other thing that this article points to is the Employment Rights Act. Now, the Employment Rights Act, I think, was passed sometime last year, but the different elements of it are coming in at different times. One of the things that changes this month is a national minimum wage, which is nearly £13 an hour now. And new rights for workers like sickness benefit from day one. Now, you might say, that's something that is a real benefit to workers. I'm actually not that sure it is, because I think it will be a worry for employers who may be less willing to take people on if they think that that's a risk to their business. Certainly, I know that when I was an employer, you might be willing to take a chance on somebody who's perhaps had some sickness in the past, because you think, well, you at least have a period where you're trying them out and you're not required to immediately pay them sick pay. But now you are. I think you'll be less likely, in particular, to take a chance on people who have had some sickness in the past. So I'm not sure it's a great help. How would you know
if they'd had sickness in the past? Did they have to divulge that?
You would take a reference from their previous employer, and one of the things the previous employer will generally tell you is how much sick leave they've taken.
And do they have to tell you?
They don't. No, employers don't have to give a reference. Lots of employers actually don't give a reference at all these days. Getting a reference from a previous employer now is generally it's a very, very short report that they give you. So they will say, I employed this person from this time to this time. This is a record of a sickness absence. They didn't leave for any reason associated with fraud or yeah. Well, they wouldn't mention poor performance, because often people will have left through poor performance, and that won't be covered in their reference.
Surely they'd have to say if they were fired.
No.
No?
No.
Oh, okay. So just on this argument of the Employment Rights Act, and similarly to me, it feels quite similar to the Renters' Rights Bill in that, on the face of it, a lot of people will be feeling positive because they think, okay, that's more rights for people renting, that's more rights for employees.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side, people will say, yeah, but landlords are going to be less likely to want to rent out places now, and they'll want much more assured thing because they know that they can't evict, through no-fault evictions. And it's the same with, in the employers' side on in occupation, is that they can't, they have to give sick pay from day one, etc. Now, is there, some people might sort of say, fine, I can understand your argument there, but surely everybody deserves sick pay from day one, and everybody deserves assured tenancy. In a similar way to the minimum wage, everyone deserves a decent wage, even if people are aware of the fact that it might discourage certain employers from hiring people.
I think it's a particular issue, I would say, for smaller employers. So, I remember first starting a business, and when you're really trying to make ends meet, and if anybody who started a business will know that you don't pay yourself for a good few years, because you just don't have enough money to spare, and when you're having to spend some of that money paying sick pay to somebody who's not actually producing the work, where does that money come from? And I think that is a real barrier to people. Perhaps not a barrier to people setting up businesses, but certainly a barrier to people taking on new people. Now, you say everybody should be entitled to sick pay from day one. Possibly, but if you're going to make the employer responsible for paying that, you have to accept that is something that will stop businesses expanding. Now, you could say everybody's entitled to sick pay from day one, but it's the state that pays it. That would be a way that would mean it's less of an issue for individual employers. But then who's policing that? And you get to the same situation that we're getting to now with PIP payments, where who's the gatekeeper to that, and that seems to me quite problematic as well. So, I do think it's not unreasonable to expect somebody who's started a job to spend their first 3 months, 6 months working really, really hard and not taking a day off sick. And I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to ask of people.
Yeah, and I suppose if you're trying to envisage a job market which is adequate for your country, you'd be hoping that wages were good enough that people weren't living hand to mouth and weren't suddenly destitute if they had to go off sick for a week.
Good point.
We can probably aspire to more of that.
Absolutely. Yes, you're right. That's a really good point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, getting back to the Employment Rights Act.
Yes.
So, one of the things I would say about it is that it's giving, some of the elements of it are giving individuals more rights.
I thought you were going to use a bit of really young slang then. It's giving, do you know this?
No.
It's giving, and they'll come up with an adjective. It will be like, that's the slang. It's giving.
Oh,
have you never heard that?
What does it mean?
It's like it has a certain mood, I think. People are going to be laughing at the Gen Z listeners will be laughing at me.
Right, okay.
But they'll say like, it's giving happiness, or it's giving joy.
Okay.
To mean like it has a certain atmosphere of that.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well...
I can't believe you've never heard that.
I wasn't going to say that.
You're more down with the kids than I am, I think. Sorry, it's giving something. I'm now completely blown us off course.
You have blown
What
us
was it
off
giving?
completely, of course. It's giving individuals more rights. So I think some of the perception that it's giving unions more rights is actually wrong. It's not giving unions more rights, it's giving individuals more rights. And in some ways, the more individuals have rights, the less power that gives to trade unions.
And are the unions generally in favour of this bill?
Yes.
This act. It's an act
Yes,
now, isn't it?
it's an act, yeah. Yeah, they are in favour of it. And you know, I think part of the reason is that I think many trade unions have now kind of almost given up on the idea of collective action, and what they want is more individual rights and a kind of legalistic approach to defending workers rather than one that depends on industrial strength. And I think that's not a good thing. I would rather unions concentrated on organising collectively than, you know, almost pleading for additional benefits or rights or privileges for workers. I think the thing that really has made a difference, if you look historically, has been when trade unions have collectively fought to improve things like pay and conditions, health and safety, all those kind of things.
This is something that wasn't so clear to me than when you gave that talk recently. You started getting me to think about this difference between, and this is partly due to my age, because I've grown up in a much more individualistic society, and I hadn't considered this idea that trade unions have moved from this area of sort of collectivism to individualism, and they've had to respond to the individualism of our current society. So I think what you're saying is that in the past there'd be a collective agreement on something where all of the workers would come together and they would get a collective solution.
Correct.
Right? Whereas now the unions have sort of accepted defeat on certain things and said, okay, well, we can fight for more individual rights, like sick pay from day one. Yeah,
and I think, you know, if you wanted to say when did this happen, the thing that always sticks in my mind, I don't know if you'll know about this, is in 1988 at the Trade Union Trade Union Congress, Jacques Delors attended. Do you know about this?
No, go on.
And the TUC delegates sang in French Frère Jacques to him.
Right.
Because in the trade union we call people brother.
Yeah.
So Brother Jacques, you know, that.
Yeah.
And to me, that was a kind of, it was almost the moment where you saw really clearly that the trade unions were kind of saying, let's go down the European route of seeking legal rights granted through social contract legislation rather than winning rights in a kind of industrial bargaining negotiation. Mm-hmm. And in some ways you can't blame them. If you look back to what had happened there, the miners had been defeated in 1984. The trade unions were effectively being power was being taken away from them. So the Thatcher legislation was coming in. They were really struggling. And so this alternative way of doing things, which looked very new and continental and sophisticated, I think was very attractive. But I think it has been a bit of a fool's errand. And I think at the end of the day, Thatcher destroyed trade unions by destroying industry. And, you know, you look at those swathes of, you know, the old Red Wall areas where all that industry has gone. You know, we talked the other week, didn't we, about Denby pottery going. So we're continuing to see the deindustrialisation of huge swathes of the country. And, you know, deindustrialisation does take away the power where trade union power lay. And I think if you want to rebuild the trade union movement, if you want to rebuild trade union power, you rebuild industry. You don't do it by looking for sick pay from day one.
I suppose because you're importing things from elsewhere, you have no concern of those conditions for those workers. And if they were, you know, if those workers were to demand better conditions, you could be importing things from a different country.
I mean, that's an interesting point. You know, in the past, there has been a real history of internationalism in the trade union movement. You might remember that Lancashire cotton workers refused to work with cotton that was imported after it had been, it had been picked by slaves. So I think that idea of having international solidarity with other workers is something that's really gone. And again, that's something that I think would be great to make a comeback. You know, if people were saying, you know, we're not going to accept the importation of cheap goods that has been made with slave labour, that would be great. But you don't see it happening, do you?
Mm. It's an amazing story, that, and it's sort of lost some of its awe for me, because Andy Burnham mentions it every single time I go to see him speak.
Okay,
and he knows that he's mentioning it a lot as well, because as he goes to say it, he says, "Oh, some of my team will be rolling their eyes at the back there." I was given a guided tour yesterday to some friends that were visiting, and I was showing them the Abraham Lincoln statue.
Yeah.
Manchester City Centre, just off Albert Square, which has a lovely plaque as a message from Abraham Lincoln to the workers of Manchester that refused to handle slave bit cotton.
Lancashire, not Manchester.
Sorry?
Workers of Lancashire.
Which Manchester was in?
Yes, yeah. But more broadly, not just Manchester.
Very good. Two things. One is, when you're talking about Thatcher and the reason that she was able to defeat the miners' strikes and so on, are you sort of saying is the right analogy to say you've got a pest problem in your house, and you put all of this very highly sort of technological powder and traps and all these things down, and then you burn the house down and you say, "Oh, look, the traps worked." Is it something like that?
Yeah, I think that's not a bad analogy. Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I'm not sure about comparing workers to vermin, but
I wasn't. You're always trying to get me into trouble. The second thing then, and this is more broad look at the whole trade union question, because you come out with some really interesting points and things that I'd never heard before. But then somebody listening to this might be thinking, okay, come on, what does Hilary think? Like, which side is Hilary on here?
Yeah.
And they might think, okay, so there's, in our sort of, and certainly for me, my very amateur understanding of that time before I was alive, you know, you've got those battles between Scargill and Thatcher, and it sounds like you're coming down on the side of the trade unions, and you've said that some of the Thatcher legislation was quite a problem, and that it's
still is.
Yeah, it still is making things bad. So where do you stand on that? Like, what are you just trying to concoct a 1970s vision of Britain?
No. So I think that there was a time in the 1970s when the ability of the trade unions to really flex their industrial muscles was such that they became a bit too trigger happy to, you know, walk out on strike. But I think every trade union now and then, I think, would still say that nobody wants to take their workers out on strike. You only do it when it's the only thing that you've got left. And so I think it's very easy to blame all the industrial disputes of the 1970s on the trade unions, and not to say that, well, actually, there was a failure in mismanagement of businesses and the state to negotiate in good faith with trade unions. You know, it's like in a war, you can't have one side fighting and the other side not. Both sides have got to be fighting. And that whole analysis of the 1970s is that it was the trade union's fault. And, you know, if you look at the miners' strike in particular, what the miners were striking for was to save their jobs and their communities. Now, what's so bad about that? So I think a lot of those strikes were absolutely on the right side. And, you know, if you look back and try to say, with what we know now, were those strikes the right thing to do? I think you would say, yes. It's the fact that the strikes weren't successful that's the problem, because the strikes weren't successful, all those coal fields were shut down. All those communities are still massively short on jobs. You know, the kind of replacement jobs have been in the kind of heritage and retail industries, not proper jobs, not proper engineering jobs, not proper well-paid, good quality jobs where you're producing something. And actually, had the strikes been more successful in defending industry, perhaps would have been in a better position now. So I do think when people look back, they perhaps have absorbed this kind of Thatcher idea that everything about the trade unions was wrong and everything about business was right. And I really don't think that is the case. It sounds like Friday is on the side of Thatcher, do you think?
Friday is upset with you.
Perhaps just something to pick up, because it kind of leads into it from that discussion about the Employment Rights Act. So one of the changes is if a workforce wants to be recognised by their employer, at the moment they have to win a ballot where at least I think it's 40% of the workforce have to agree to the introduction of a trade union. One of the changes is that you just have to get a majority of whoever votes under the new requirements. And, you know, I think that's okay. I don't have a problem with that. There is a suggestion that the government, well, there's a clause in the legislation that would allow the government to reduce the number of people who have to want a trade union down from the current 10% before there can be a ballot as to whether you have one, down to 2%. I actually don't think even the trade unions would want that, because I think that opens it up to some of the people who might... Sometimes you get a group of people in an organisation who've got one particular grievance that's, you know, concerning them. And sometimes those little cliques of workers can be quite problematic in a workplace. So I don't think they would reduce it to 2%. But I do think that one of the ways I would criticise the NUM of old and back in 1984 was that one of the things they didn't want to do, and the government wanted them to do, was to hold a ballot of all their members on the strike action. And the reason they didn't want to have a ballot was because they weren't confident they would win it. And my view would be that they should have said, yes, there has to be a ballot. We agree there should be a ballot. And we need to go out and win over all our workers as to why strike action is right. And it's because they didn't do that, they weren't prepared to have those really tough arguments, that you got different regions who didn't really engage with all the discussion and therefore kind of made decisions that were right for them as individuals. And I think that lack of confidence in your ability to win workers round is one of the reasons why people perhaps felt in the olden days, in the 1970s, that trade unions were forcing their view on workers rather than having those arguments. And I think there's a lot of that about today. We've talked about some of the areas where trade unions perhaps let their members down. We talked at one point about the Darlington nurses, where this is where nurses are being forced to change in front of men in women's only spaces, and their trade union has not defended those women. And you know, again, I do think that's the case of the kind of leadership of a trade union having one idea and just imposing that idea without having that discussion with their members. So I think trade unions have to be a body that really lives and breathes democracy. And perhaps they never have quite lived up to that. But I think that's what you would want to hold them to.